In tracks, she's cocky and arrogant, but so full of youthful chutzpah that you forgive her. She emerges 10 years on in Desert Places, a chronicle of 2 years spent living with nomads in India. Life has beaten the cockiness out of her, but what remains constant is her passion for truth, for getting behind her own and other people's acts. I can see that she might be a difficult person to be around, but she has never been difficult to conjure. I have relied on her to fly to me, Ariel-like, from that other part of my consciousness where she dwells, and she has never failed me until now. When I wrote Tracks, I did not doubt that I had a right to speak. I did not know that what I was doing was extremely difficult. I was not aware of a vast audience out there in the dark. The fictionalizing of myself was instinctive, guileless, and completely candid. But I now know that writing is the most difficult thing on earth to do, that published words are powerful, that while one has a sacred responsibility to try to get at the truth, one has also to remember that truth is relative, and one person's version of it can bury another's. The belief that memoirists simply describe people who were or are already there is as naive as the belief that we are transcribing events as they actually occurred, as if we need only pull back a curtain to reveal the scene as it was, the people as they were. Of course, this is nonsense. My sister's version of my mother's story is so different from mine that it is as if we emerged from different wombs. I would like to be able to leave my sister entirely out of my version, but whatever curtain I pull back, there she is, vast and unavoidable, centre stage, larger than my mother, larger than my father, and much, much larger than me. I don't feel anything when I think of my mother's death. I have imagined the act, what it required to do it, but it holds no special significance for me. I suppose by the time she killed herself, I was already quite far away. In any case, when I touch the area around that day now, I feel only callous. The day opens for me at about 3:30 p.m. This must be the time because I have just left the school grounds and am looking down the street towards our house. We have only lived here for a year or two, having moved from the country. All of us, in our different ways, struggle against suburban life like trapped birds. I loathe the Moreton Bay beaches just a half-mile from our house. The water is waveless and opaque, and it contains jellyfish. The beaches are narrow and lonely. Summer afternoon, cotton frock. No rope petticoat or gold sandals visible. Right hand clasping handle of school port. I am standing still, looking down the street to our house, which is different from the other houses. Our house is 2-story with patios, built by an Italian. My mother says it's vulgar. Inside the house, every room is filled with an obscure dreariness, even though light pours through the Venetians. My mother, unable to get out of bed one day, told me God had come to her through those Venetians and held her hand. As I approach the house, I see that there is a police car outside it. My father is standing at the front of the house in his car keys. It appears someone has thrown a bucket of water over him. Next to him is our neighbour, Mrs. Wallace. As I walk towards my father, he bends down to take me in his arms, something he has never done before. He says, "Mummy's dead, darling." I reject him and allow myself to be held by the neighbour. I cry, but only because this is expected. The next memory is being out on the golf course behind the house with Mrs. Wallace. She says comforting things and I humour her. My dog, Goldie, is there. I feel I should be with someone else, not the neighbour. I still don't feel as I believe I should feel. I don't feel sad or grief-stricken, for example. But there is a dread in my body. Not pain, but numb pain. It's not pain being done to you, it's pain that is you. Later, I am in the back of a taxi with my sister, who is 18. Or perhaps it's the police car. She looks as if someone has just slapped her in the face. She has taken control of things. I am to go and live with my father's twin sister on Tambourine Mountain, but I won't be able to take my dog. Those are the seeds embedded from that day. I can go back to them, just as I went back to that memory of the gold sandals, crack them all open, and from each one I could fashion a deluge, an infinitude of memoirs. But would they be true? Would they be fair? As dispassionately as I've tried to describe the residue of that day, the whole passage is still hopelessly skewed by the first-person pronoun, especially the bit about the dog. The dog was indeed destroyed, but the problem with including this fact is that it appears that I am asking the reader for special dispensation. I don't deny that to kill the pet of a child whose mother has just hanged herself is a strange thing to do. But the interesting thing about it is precisely that it is a strange thing to do, not that it happened to me. But if I leave out the dog, where does the leaving out end? Whom do I erase from the scene of that day? My sister, unlike my parents, is still alive. Her story is still unfolding. How can I assume the power of writing her into my version, fixing her like a fly into my amber? And how could I be sure, while writing her lines, that I was doing my authorial duty to understand her and never judge her? To love her with the detachment necessary for saints and fictionalists. What do we owe to the living and what to the dead? What is the morality of memoir? My mother died when she was 46. It never crossed my mind to write about her until I approached the same age. Then that forgotten, safely buried woman came back with, quite literally, a vengeance. It was as if she were begging me to release her from the prison of other people's stories. It was my duty to do so. I was her favourite. There had always been a pact between us. Now I must honour that pact and be her witness, her voice. She had been misrepresented, dishonoured, murdered. My mother always overestimated my talents. The job she has given me is beyond them. I fail her as consistently as Hamlet fails his ghost. How, I ask you, with her behind one shoulder and my sister behind the other, with all those readers sitting out there in front of me, their faces full of scepticism, or worse, the desire to see me fail, how am I expected to come up with the truth when I know that no such thing exists? When I cannot even find a way past that imaginary woman dangling from the cord of our electrical kettle, or that monolithic imaginary sister, or my imaginary self? But what about if I forget about them for a while and imagine instead that most important character in any memoir, time? Were I to write again about the day of my mother's death, I might not mention the walk home from school, or the dog, or my poor father, or my poor sister. I might leave out entirely that impassable sentence, "My mother hanged herself." I might try instead to focus on the kettle. It was one of those yellow, chunky kettles with a black flip-up lid. Bakelite, I should think. A 50s kettle. From that kettle, which sits on the Laminex counter next to our new electric fry pan, I might describe 1961 as it was in a kitchen in a suburb outside Brisbane. And from that year might unfurl previous years. Mooloolah siding on the North Coast line, where my sister rode her horse to school and sometimes let me double behind her, where my dad sheared sheep by hand while my sister and I stamped the wool in the wool press and the big green carpet snake hung down from the rafters above us, where I got stomachache after stealing Mad Valerie's peaches, where my father and mother flicked each other with tea towels in the kitchen and laughed till the tears ran, where the kids at school had cow shit between their toes, where I couldn't bear to see my sister teased, where I saw my father punishing the horse with his stock whip, where the Gripsky's bull chased Grandy and me up a tree. And before Mooloolah there was Stanley Park, the cattle station where I was born, and my mother's terror of snakes and loneliness, and the buggy by the barbed wire fence, and picking bluebells along the dirt track to the house, and sing-songs around the piano. And before that, there was a war during which my mother and father fell in love, and before that war there was a depression, and before that there was another war, and my parents' worlds contained the seeds of these events, so that although the kettle is the only seed common to all of us, nevertheless coded in it are all these other memories that existed before I was born and that I have inherited. The past is not sealed, not immutable, and it does not belong to anyone. It is an impression left by the telling of stories. I want to invent a world for my mother in which she is free to speak for herself and for her time, to fictionalize her own life. It is what we all do incessantly in an effort to find a personal truth, that glint of gold, to make sense of ourselves and of history, to keep the past open. Thank you.
I was intrigued by your metaphor, and I will try and quote it if I may. The writer of life writing, the memoirist, frees people from the prison of other people's stories. I thought that was an extraordinary statement. And I wondered if you'd like to talk a little more about that, because that seems to put the writer into a really interesting position.
Yes, a terrifying position, actually. Well, I think once something is written down, it is necessarily frozen, and it takes on an authority that appears to cancel out it destroys the actual fluidity of life, the fact that life is constantly changing, that life is a dialogue between what actually happens and one's own interpretation of what actually happens. So yes, I think that in this form, the memoir form and autobiography and indeed biography, inherently have these problems, which is to set a life or a time in, as I said, in amber, and it can be very unfair, seemingly, to people, to real characters who are set in that amber. Essentially, it's a technical problem, and that finding of the voice, which is why I put the thing aside, because I knew that I wasn't quite ready to be dispassionate enough to to accept the responsibility, I suppose, for writing the story. I think this kind of self-consciousness, or this anxiety around the self and writing about the self, is a contemporary phenomenon. I mean, older styles of memoirs didn't have the same kind of anxiety. In fact, a friend of mine in London produced his memoir. He's 80 now, and he produced his memoir, and it was so charming because it was completely without. It seemed to show no inner life whatsoever. It was all about this is what happened, and charming, but it's a form that doesn't speak to or deal with the anxieties and complexities around the idea of a self in our era. What's the difference between memoir and autobiography? Well, pretty fine point. I suppose I feel that memoir involves another person, other people, whereas straight autobiography, you're so self-focused. I also think that autobiography is potentially a more rigid form. You can't play around with it as much as you can potentially with memoir. So, for example, in this memoir, necessarily there's going to have to be a lot of fictional work involved, because I don't remember my mother particularly well. So yes, I suppose that would be my instinctive sense of the difference between the two forms, whereas autobiography, at least you have the illusion that the person is absolutely rigidly recounting their own story. As I said, it's taken me all these years to not exactly muster up the courage for this book, but leave it alone long enough to feel more confident, somewhat confident, about plunging in, because I've simply processed a lot more material and information. And indeed that phase of first sort of thinking about her again, and really I hadn't thought about her since she died, truly. And then thinking about her, a lot of the material was very raw, far too sort of pluggy, which is one of the problems I think exists with memoir. It can be very unprocessed and therefore not good literature.
Well, perhaps at that point then we might call the session to a halt. And I'd like to finish, if I may, with a statement about Australian writing. I think some of the best Australian writing is now, frankly, not in our fiction, but in our life writing, in our memoir, in our meditative writing. And I think Robyn Davidson is an astonishing example of that. So please thank Robyn Davidson.
Thank you. Thank you.